My name is David Bishop. Just a quick test of the room. How many people here have hardly read comics or graphic novels at all? Bit of a foreign territory to them. How many people have sort of read a few comics or graphic novels over the years, but don't have like an entire shelf full of them, or a whole room full of them, or a whole house full of them? Okay, good. And how many people are hardcore comics readers? Good, so there's a mix. All right, fine, okay. So for the hardcore comics readers, some of this you may already know or have experienced previously, so I apologize in advance to everybody else. I'll try not to insult anybody's intelligence, or at least not everybody's intelligence simultaneously. Comics, the durable mutation, is the subject of what I'll be wittering about today. Comics seem to be everywhere at the moment. Just when I think interest and enthusiasm for this medium, not a genre, medium, is peaking, then something else will come along and give it another good goosing, so to speak. At the end of 2012, not one but two graphic novels were shortlisted for various aspects of the prestigious Costa Book Awards. Days of the Bagnall Summer by Geoff Winterhart was up for Best Novel, the first time a graphic novel had been shortlisted for Best Novel, although it inevitably won, as everybody else did that year, to Hilary Mantel's Bring Out the Bodies, the Warhol sequel. But Daughter of Her Father's Eyes by Mary and Brian Talbot won the Best Biography Award. And it was the first time a graphic novel had been shortlisted for Best Biography at Costas, let alone actually won. And indeed, I know one of the people who were the judges for the Booker last year, the Man Booker Prize, and they were trying to get graphic novels onto the shortlist, and weirdly, no publishers were submitting graphic novels for the Man Booker Award. Well, that's partly because publishers are only allowed to put two books up, in any given year. So there's a movement towards what you might call literary respectability is going on within comics and graphic novels at the moment. Last summer, here in Edinburgh, the Edinburgh International Book Festival had a special strand of 40 events about comics and graphic novels called Stripped, which brought a huge boost in visitor numbers to Charlotte Square for the book festival, and brought them an entirely different audience from the sort of people who normally go to book festival events. So slightly less of the Morningside matrons, slightly more of the facial piercings and the tattoos was turning up in Charlotte Square, which sort of generally lowered the age range of people in Charlotte Square by about 10 years collectively, I think, which is a good thing as far as I'm concerned. Just last Saturday, The Guardian devoted its weekend magazine's colour supplement to comics and graphic novels, and they commissioned new stories in art, or adaptations of stories, with the likes of Margaret Atwood, Audrey Niffenegger, Gillian Flynn, who wrote Gone Girl, collaborating with some of the best artists out there. This is Dave Gibbons, which was Gillian Flynn worked with, and this is Michael Michel, how do you say his name? Fabo, who did Under the Skin. He worked with my old marker Roger Langridge, who's from New Zealand like me, and they did a strip, a very good strip actually, extracting the urine from David Cameron, which is always a good thing as far as I'm concerned, but let's leave politics out of it if at all humanly possible. And this weekend, the British Library is devoting its spring exhibition to British comics. It's called Art and Anarchy in the UK. It opens this Friday and runs through to the middle of August, where they've looked at 9 different strands of comics and graphic novels, how they've evolved and changed and affected or reflected British society over the past 200 years, effectively. So, all of that's been going on. So, comics and graphic novels have a higher degree of visibility now than they've probably enjoyed ever, and what might be termed respectability, or at least a lot more attention from sort of the broadsheet media in the country. Now the question is, why are comics getting all this attention? And I would argue there's a cumulative effect that's been going on for the better part of 30 years. But also it's because comics have the ability to adapt. They're a durable mutation amongst storytelling media. and they adapt to their environment, and they adapt to emerging technologies, and they embrace new technology as they come along, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. But the core of comic storytelling endures and mutates. Indeed, technology advances have driven that evolution, as we'll see. Now, I believe comics are one of the most interactive forms of storytelling that we've come up with. They use a combination of words and pictures and symbols to communicate narrative in a unique and, when done well, subtle way. Not always, sadly, but when done well, subtle way. Engaging the reader's imagination both by what is shown and, crucially, by what is omitted. Because so much of comic storytelling is about concision, it's about what isn't on the page, it's about what isn't shown, it's engaging you as the reader to join the dots, to fill the gaps in. So, in this talk I'm going to explore how and why such a seemingly simple form of storytelling is able to continually reinvent itself, and I'll show you how it's done that. And I might even foolishly speculate about where comics are headed. Although everybody who does that, the early adopters usually end up bloody, as happens to anybody who's first through the wall. It's also worth saying that this talk is probably going to be out of date by the time I finish speaking. Digital comics, web comics, it's the Wild West. It's the bold frontier, and it changes every week. Something new happens, changes or alters the face of it and what's going on. It doesn't necessarily alter how stories are told, but it's all the paraphernalia that goes around that gets changed. But before we get into all of that, a little bit about who I am, why I'm talking to you about this, and why I talk about comics at all. As you'll have told from my accent, I'm from New Zealand. It's a long way away. If I get any further away, I'll be on my way back. I've sort of reached the limit of the rubber band now. So I grew up in New Zealand reading a mixture of British comics, that's 2000 AD, iconic British science fiction anthology, which would turn up 4 months late. About now we'd be reading the Christmas issue of 2000 AD actually, because they came on a very slow boat, possibly via China. I used to read American comics because I liked the colour, because I was young and fickle. I chose this one because it's the first comic I ever shoplifted. I've stopped shoplifting now, I hasten to add. And this is The Phantom, who's the most popular comic in Australasia and has been for 60 years, outsells X-Men, Spider-Man, Batman, any other comic you've ever heard of. And it's reprints of newspaper strips and stories created for the European market, reprinted into English. And it's still going today, 60 years on. Back when I was reading comics growing up in New Zealand, I think it was the Neolithic era known as before broadband, when dinosaurs still walked the earth. If you couldn't buy a comic when it first came out, then that was it. You never saw it again. There were no specialist comic shops, there was no such thing as back issues, there were no digital comics, there were no web comics, there was no graphic novel collections, nothing. You bought it when it came out, or you never saw it again. That was it. It was gone. It was history. Things have changed a bit since then, I'm happy to say. Anyway, fast forward to 1990. I emigrated to the UK in search of work. I was a trained journalist and sub-editor at the time, but I fell in with a bad crowd. I became a comics editor. It's been downhill ever since. So I helped launch this title, Judge Dredd magazine, which is still going 24 years later, although can't claim too much credit for that. And I worked there for 5 years, became editor pretty quickly, and then at the end of 95 I became editor of this, 2000 AD. Again, it's full circle for me. There are a series of full circles, one over the other. My life is one big Venn diagram of strangeness. So yes, I worked on 2000 AD, but I quit in the year 2000, moved to Scotland and became a freelance writer, but I've kept my hand in with comics ever since. I've done some freelance editing. I've contributed to various Kickstarter campaigns where I've been a stretch goal. I've always wanted to be a stretch goal. It was one of my ambitions when I was 7 to be a stretch goal. And I've kept writing comics. So this is a strip I wrote for the magazine, World War II vampires on the Eastern Front, as you do. And ironically, this is the Swedish edition of Phantom, which is still going, and I write. I've just written my 45th issue of Fantomen comic. Not in Swedish, I hasten to add, they translate it for me. The only word I know in Swedish is for the end, which is slut. Which is always problematic if the last picture is a picture of a woman and it just says slut underneath. I just look at it and go, really, we're sending the wrong message here. we don't have enough gender problems in comics to begin with, but that's getting better at least. So I have been working professionally in comics for 25 years now, editing, writing, and latterly I've been teaching a unique module called Writing Graphic Fiction, which is about writing scripts for comics and graphic novels, which is at Edinburgh University competition on the MA in Creative Writing, which has been running for about 5 years now. And the more I learn about comics as a narrative medium, the more I like to enthuse others, which is why I'll probably talk quite quickly at you over the course of the next 38 minutes. But you can keep up, I'm sure. So let's talk about how comics have evolved over time. Now obviously this is not comics, this is cave drawings, this is 30,000 to 32,000 years old. However, mankind, humanity, begins by trying to tell stories, to try and explain their life to each other, to try and leave some record behind of themselves, to try and make sense of what's happening in and around themselves. And they started doing this through pictorial representations. This is hunting, we've caught it, now we're going to cook it, then we're going to have a fire, I'm going to have an enormous penis, but that's something else entirely. So that is cave drawing. So already we start to have narrative told through sequence. Here we have relief sculptures carved into columns. This is in Rome. This curls up the column hundreds of feet into the air, and it tells the story of the Emperor Trajan, I don't know how you say his name, so apologies for mispronouncing that, any ancient Romans in the room. But again, it's telling stories, it's told through pictorial representations, it's a series of events recorded. It's almost like the newspapers of the day, effectively. So that's about 2,000 years ago. Fast forward to the 11th century, this is the Bayeux Tapestry, about 200 foot long, spot of embroidery, and again, we're telling stories, we're making sense of life in the court, cooking, there's a lot of cooking goes on in early comics, it has to be said. And over here we have Halley's Comet is coming over because it's 1066 and it's all about to kick off. Illuminated manuscripts from Spain, we're now into the 13th century, and already we haven't even got to the printing press yet, and yet we start to see a lot of the artifacts that you associate with comics today. We've got panel borders, we've got stories told in sequence, we've even got captions explaining what's going on for those of you who can read and write in 13th century Spain. Probably not that many people, but there you go. But they can still look at the pictures and figure out what's going on. So this is two different stories. They read in a slightly unusual manner from what we're used to, at least in Western cultures these days. But already, even before we've got the printing press, we've got a lot of what you associate with how comics look now. And that's in the 13th century. Fast forwarding on a bit more through the evolution and history of comics, this is 1682. This is Barlow's A True Narrative of the Horrid, Hellish, Popish Plot, and we'll just leave the sectarian elements of this to one side. It's been Scotland. And again, panel borders, stories told in sequence, people being characterized, captions that tell us what's going on, but the new innovation here, speech balloons. Speech balloons, or in this case, a little scroll that unwinds and comes out of people's mouths with what they're saying written on it. I just wish that happened in real life. I'd like a little scroll to come out. Maybe ticker tape these days. I talk quite quickly, it would need to be ticker tape. But yeah, so we're now into the printing press, and these would be printed up and sold. Commerce has now entered the situation. Previously it was a way of recording history, telling stories, sharing narratives. Now commerce has entered the fray, and very quickly people started selling, ironically, comics merchandise featuring characters from stories like this in the 17th and 18th century. Moving on, we're now into the late 19th century. This is Cats and Jammer Kids. This is a newspaper strip. This is where comics appear in other publications. There's a humour strip, very cartoony, cartoon representations of characters. This is actually this is in America, but it was ripped off from a German strip called Max und Mort, about two mischievous children, and they get into scrapes here. They train a monkey to beat people, because that always goes well, and they get spanked at the end of it. So that's, we have comics have gone into newspapers, broad audience. By the 1930s, the kind of stories being told was mutating and changing. Where previously comics had tended to be short stories, often humour-led gag strips, now we're getting extended narratives, serialised forms. adventure stories, the representations of characters are becoming, well, I don't know about more realistic in the case of Dick Tracy, but in the ballpark. And here we have the gorgeous Alex Raymond doing Flash Gordon, where the representations of people became much more realistic and not fine art, but you know what I mean, by comparison to Cats and Gemma Kids. Let's leave aside the fact that Flash is tossing as in his troubled slumber. That's just awareness of the 1930s for you. 1938, this is kind of where the modern print era of comics really begins, and where the template for at least American and British comics was established that would last us through to the digital age. On the left we have Action Comics #1, dated June 1938. This introduces Superman, still going strong, costumed superhero, strange visitor from another planet, and this is what the shape of most American comics are going to look like for the next 80 years, effectively, 70, 80 years. 1 or 2 stories per issue, published monthly, often sort of adolescent power fantasies, frankly. Generally standalone stories, although the storytelling has elongated over time in American comics. But this pretty much set the template for a lot of what followed for the next 70 years. By comparison, in Britain, published within 30 days of it, we have the first issue of the Beano comic. So this is weekly, it's an anthology. Most of the content is in black and white. American stuff's all in colour because it was just expected to be in colour. Often humour-based, perceived to be for children. The other thing you've got going on is often a very anti-authority, subversive element going on, a sort of underlying anarchy going on, which is why the British Library exhibition is called Art and Anarchy, because this has always been going on in British comics. You don't tend to get a lot of superheroes in British comics because British people, the audience is just too cynical. Sorry, but we just are. Just too cynical. We don't believe in apple pie and it's all going to be much better, which is why the most popular American superhero is Batman, a guy who saw his parents murdered and then uses his fortune to dress up as a giant flying rat and hit people, because that appeals to the British sensibility. Yes, it does. The Beano became pretty much the template for British comics for the next 70, 80 years. Action Comics and Superman is where a lot of American comics went. I'm going to fast forward through bits of this. So, particularly American comics went out into the world after World War II and sort of infected or impacted on other cultures. Although Japanese comics, usually called manga, pre-existed before the war, the influence of comics brought by GIs into America helped to bring a different kind of storytelling sensibility to what was being done. Again, this durable mutation creeps in, cross-pollinates from one culture into another. This is Astro Boy. As one example of that from the 1950s. You get Tintin in Belgium as well as another thing that's been influenced by the spread of American comics post-World War II. Now, things pretty much roll along in this fashion. I've skipped over big chunks of it, but that doesn't matter. Until we get to about 1986 and the unholy trinity of graphic novels emerge. We have Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons, 2 British creators, which rewrote superheroes through a prism of grim, gritty, what would actually happen if people had superpowers in the real world, what would the impact of that be, and what would they actually be like. Dark Knight Returns, which reimagined by Frank Miller, with help from Klaus Janson and Lynn Varley, which reimagined Batman into the future and is pretty much one of the templates for the grim and gritty Batman films we've had lately. And then The Complete Mouse, which is sort of the oddball in this trio of stories by Art Spiegelman, which it actually was, at this point, 14 years of work. It would take another 6 years to complete, and is part memoir, part biography, part autobiography, and is in fact about the Holocaust and its impact on family, on art, and his relationship with his parents, both of whom survived being in Auschwitz, and did all sorts of fascinating and interesting and controversial things. It depicted the Jews were mice, the Nazis were cats, the Poles were pigs, which caused all sorts of problems, frankly, when it got published in Poland, and you can understand why. They gave it a special Pulitzer Prize award because of recognition of how groundbreaking this was. It has had a huge impact on non-fiction graphic novels and comics for the simple fact that the vast majority of them are memoir-based in some way, shape, or form. Doctor of the Father's Eyes is classic creative non-fiction, in some ways following in the footsteps of The Complete Mouse. So that was 1986. And that was the moment where comics had stopped being just for kids, which they'd sort of become after the Second World War, comics became infantilized and were deemed as something just for kids and not for grown-ups. In reality, by the early 1950s, 150 million comics were being sold every month in America. They were being sold to housewives, they were being sold to GIs, they were being sold to grown-ups as well as to kids. It didn't matter who you were, there was a comic for everybody in America. In the 1950s, romance, western, detective, horror, crime, etc. And then there was accusations that they were corrupting the youth of America, and then they had to self-censor themselves. That's another whole ball of wax, we won't get into that. That's politics for you. Anyway, so this started to drag comics into some sort of appreciation as an adult art form, which it has been since the 60s in France. Frankly, it's called the ninth art across the channel. Independent comics were still doing interesting things. This is from Cerebus the Aardvark, 300 issues, 6,000 pages by one man and his mate. The story of an aardvark who becomes Pope at one point, as you do, and where this happens, this is him hanging out with his Groucho Marx mate Julius. And the other thing that we've happened is that independent comics, have been the tipping edge for comics crossing over into other media. So you get an awful lot of comics and graphic novels which are now being adapted for film and TV, and in games of course. But this is The Walking Dead, which was started off selling 2,000 copies, word of mouth about how good it was, drove sales up, and then the TV series came out and absolutely exploded. And issue 100 of this sold 360,000 copies in a month. It was the best-selling comic for about 10 years, and nobody would have figured that because everybody thought American comics were superheroes, but the success of things like Walking Dead have proven there's more to life in comics in America than men in tights and capes hitting each other. Much as I love a bit of homoeroticism, there is more to life to comics than that. Okay, so moving on from the evolution of comics, we'll come back and talk about how web and digital has changed comics a bit later. But let's talk about how comics tell stories. They don't need paper or ink to achieve this. They don't require bits of dead tree to excite, to enthrall, to make us laugh or cry or think. They achieve all of this simply through story. Now, it's how comics tell stories. It's to do with form and content working in collaboration with each other, and also how you read them is how they communicate narrative. Now, it's really only in the last 30 or 40 years that sort of any big thinking has been done about how this works, how storytelling and narrative function through comics. And although academics, and I guess I probably qualify as one of those now, have wheedled their way into it, essentially the best thinking, I would argue, on this has been done by two comics creators. At the top here, a guy called Scott McCloud, who's written probably the gold standard for this sort of thing called understanding comics, and that's his representation of himself. And then below him is Will Eisner, who created a character called The Spirit, turned into a reprehensibly bad film by Frank Miller. Never see it. Take my advice, don't bother. Between the two of them, they've done most of the big thinking about comics really stems from ideas that they've had or concepts that they've applied from other media and applied it in. So, McLeod describes comics as juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and or produce an aesthetic response in the viewer, which is all a bit of a mouthful. And frankly, there's one phrase that you need to get out of that: deliberate sequence. Deliberate sequence. A single panel featuring pictures and perhaps text is not a comic, I would argue, it's a cartoon. Now, I love a good cartoon. They can be really good for satire and all the rest, and we can all have a good laugh at them. As a situation may arise, this one was done for the death of Margaret Thatcher. But it's not a comic per se, it's a single image. It does tell its own wee story, but comics storytelling is distinguished by deliberate sequence. This is a not entirely successful collaboration between Peanuts and your good old friendly neighbourhood Spider-Man, which I stumbled across yesterday and boggled at for quite some time. But I'm just going to leave this up there, you can read it at your own pleasure. For comics narrative to function, it needs more than one panel. Two panels create juxtaposition. You have two images side by side, and it's this juxtaposition, this positioning, that gives comics narrative its unique storytelling power. The moment you put two images side by side, whether or not there's any text, the reader, the viewer, starts searching for meaning, starts putting meaning on this juxtaposition. Absolutely. I mean, this is, hardly new thinking. But much of the storytelling in comics takes place in the gap between panels, which is generally called the gutter. So let's just look at this panel here. Charlie Brown, you must think I'm the dumbest kid ever. Lucy says, give me one more chance, please. And then we have Charlie Brown running, getting ready to come and kick the ball. Finally, he shouts, although I'm not quite sure why he shouts finally at this point. It doesn't really work in the context, but hey. And he thinks in his thought bubble, I'll kick it out of sight. Now, they're having a conversation. He's running towards the ball. You have read that, and you have automatically filled in everything that had to happen between here and here. They finished a conversation. Charlie Brown grumbly goes, all right, I'll give it one more go. Fine, okay. She positions the ball on the ground. He backs up. He goes, you ready? Yes, I'm ready. Okay, fine. He starts running towards it, shouts out finally, well thinking, I'll kick it out of sight. But all the stuff between that and that, you've done in your head. You did that yourselves. I mean, I've just explained it to you in rather laborious detail, frankly, so I do apologise for that. But you did all of that yourselves without even thinking about it. You just looked at X, you looked at Y, and you jumped from one to the other, and you filled in the gap. You closed the gap between the two panels. So we call this process closure, because we're that literal in comics, frankly. But comics ask the reader to imagine what happens between two panels, to fill in the unseen moments that aren't drawn, that aren't shown, that aren't pictured. Because comics really only operate on what can be seen, what can be read, and what can be inferred. And the gap in between is where all the inferring goes on. Inferencing? No, anyway, inferring goes on.